And let's begin this newscast with the latest on the rising tensions between Iran and the United States. Iran says that it has indisputable evidence that the US drone violated its airspace. But the US claims that the drone was over international waters in the Strait of Hormuz when it was shot down. And for more details on this news story, I'm joined in by Professor Brahma Chalani, who's a strategic analyst, and also our West Asia Bureau Chief, Daniele Pagani, who's joining me live from Jordan. Let's quickly go across to Mr. Brahma Chalani to begin with. Sir, a New York Times report states that the US abruptly withheld the decision to retaliate the downing of its drone. What's abstaining the Trump administration from retaliating?
Iran is a powerful military power, and a war with Iran could have major implications for American power globally. You would recall that when George W. Bush, as president, invaded and occupied Iraq, beginning from 2003, that invasion marked the beginning of America's relative decline globally. A war with Iran today will cause very serious damage to US's reputation that will not be easy to repair. And therefore, President Trump has to weigh the options very carefully. The fact is that Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran, even though there was no evidence that Iran had violated that nuclear deal.
Right.
And the American drone, whether it was in international airspace or over Iranian coastal airspace, the fact is that the drone flight was very provocative, because if you are going to deploy a drone along the coast of a country, you are engaging in a very provocative action. And so let's not forget that what the Americans have done is provocative, irrespective of the fact whether the drone was flying in international airspace or it was flying through Iranian coastal airspace.
All right, Mr. Brahmachalani, I'd also like to bring in Daniele on this. Daniele, Iran is claiming of an indisputable evidence to prove that the US drone was violating its airspace. What, according to you, could possibly be this indisputable evidence?
Well, we have the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who took to Twitter to publish evidence, which means he published the coordinates of the drone according to the Iranian radars and to the Iranian reconnaissance systems. It is very unlikely, though, that the United States of America did not know exactly where the drone was. But as our guest said, this is not really a matter of where exactly the drone was. The very fact that this drone, let's also be clear, this was not a small drone. This drone is 13 meters long, it has 35 meters of wing spread, and it is a $130 million military tool which is used to map and to take control and spy over a territory. So the very fact that it was all even 30 kilometers from the Iranian coastline for the Iranians wouldn't be acceptable, because from that distance this very drone could have anyway entered virtually the airspace of Iran. So it's not really about telling where exactly the drone was. What we are seeing is that President Donald Trump perhaps thought that an unmanned vehicle, which is the drone, was not worth really the military action. I would also like to underline that the American army anyway stands ready to attack. Donald Trump called off the airstrikes, but didn't call back all the troops that he meant to send. The 1,000 troops are still going. The aircraft is still roaming around the Strait of Hormuz. I would like to remember that in Bahrain there is the 5th Fleet of the United States of America, which stands ready. As of now, Donald Trump called off these very specific airstrikes. Nothing tells us that strikes or attacks are anyway on the table for another moment, maybe during a surprise moment or hitting Iran somewhere else in Syria, perhaps.
All right, let me go across to Mr. Brahmachalani. Professor, do you think that America needs to take the threats of Iran seriously, especially when it comes to closing down the Strait of Hormuz? What sort of repercussions could that bring for the US and the world?
Iran is not bluffing, because an attack on Iran will be responded to with ferocity by Iran. Iran is a country that is quite determined to retaliate with full force. And in the discussions yesterday in the White House, and it has appeared in the New York Times, that there was a split among Trump's national security advisors, with the neocons led by Pompeo, Bolton, and the CIA chief, Gina Haspel, favoring military strikes against Iran, but the military, the Pentagon, disfavoring any military action against Iran because they warned that Iran would retaliate and will lead to a spiraling escalation. So the military in the U.S. is very clear that a conflict with Iran carries major risks for U.S. troops in the region, and they have been seeking to urge the president to act cautiously. Now, this does not mean that Trump is buying the line and that there'll be no strikes against Iran. Strikes might come anytime. They could happen today, tomorrow, day after, or they could happen days or weeks later. The fact is that Trump's policy on Iran has put the U.S. on a slippery path to conflict with Iran.
All right, so U.S. on a slippery path to conflict with Iran. That's been your take. Let's also get our viewers up to date with what the New York Times reports actually suggesting. Was the U.S. planning to strike back after Iran shot down its drone? Well, a report in the U.S. media claims so, and we are referring to the New York Times report. According to this report, newspaper, U.S. President Donald Trump approved a military strike against Iran, but he suddenly aborted the plan. Now, according to the report, around 7 p.m. Washington time on Thursday, U.S. military and diplomatic officials were expecting a strike against Iran. Earlier on Thursday, there were intense discussions and debate at the White House among Trump's top national security officials and lawmakers. According to the report, senior U.S. government officials such as Foreign Minister Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and Spy Chief Gina Haspel were in favor of attacking Iran. Top defense officials were of a different opinion. They claimed that a military action could spiral out of control. It could put the U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf at risk. Now, during the course of the discussions, Trump approved an attack on Iran. He gave the nod for the attack on some Iranian targets, such as radars and missile batteries. The strike was supposed to take place just before dawn on Friday morning. But U.S. military officials soon received a word that the strike was called off. Now, according to this report, the reason for the U-turn could either be that Trump changed his mind or because of logistical reasons. But it does not mean that Trump would not approve an attack on Iran in the near future. There is no official word from either the Pentagon or the White House. Now, let's also get some more perspective on this from Professor Brahmachalani and Daniele, who's joining me live from Jordan at this moment. Professor, do you think that Trump actually needs to wage a war on Iran when he's already waging one through economic sanctions, and it's also supplemented by covert cyber actions?
The problem for Trump is that he has opened too many fronts. He's waging a trade war against China. He's also waging a different kind of war against Russia, which basically is being pursued by the U.S. Congress in the form of sanctions against Moscow. And then he's also waging trade wars against allies and friends of the United States, including India. In recent days, we have seen how the Americans have stepped up the demands on India on the trade and other fronts. So he has opened too many fronts, and then if he were to wage war against Iran at this time, it will compound America's national security challenges. This will allow China in particular to escape the growing American heat on its economy.
Right.
It will also help North Korea to deflect attention from its nuclear weapons program. So a return to a Middle East military quagmire would be very detrimental to long-term American interests. So Trump has to very carefully weigh his actions, because any action by him that could potentially lead to war with Iran could saddle the United States with long-term costs.
All right, Professor, last but not the least, do you think Iran can break out of this squeeze play by the United States by creating a larger crisis that calls for international intervention?
Iran's options are very limited because economically it's reeling under the U.S. sanctions. The oil embargo that the United States has enforced is crippling Iran's economy. Domestically, the public sentiment is not in favor of any escalation, and the leadership has to tread a very cautious path. Its options are so limited that it will seek to avoid any provocative actions. So that is the reason why it seems so unlikely that Iran shot down the American drone in international airspace. Very likely that drone was flying through Iranian coastal airspace and that Iran acted in self-defense because Iran is not in any position today to engage in offensive action.
All right. Let me also go across to Daniele at this moment. Daniele, mostly like the Russians, if you draw an analogy, the Russians in Ukraine, Iran too has chosen a similar strategy of operations through proxies. Now, their Houthi allies in Yemen have already attacked Saudi oil pipelines, civilian airports, power plants and other targets too. Do you think their stealthy tactics are almost pushing America into backing off?
Well, I'm not sure that is America which is being pushed into a path war. I would rather state the contrary. As the professor said, Iran has very limited options as of now, but it intends to use all those options. So the more the American pressure mounts on them, the more they will pull all their leverage. You cited the Houthi rebels in Yemen.
I stated that they're backing off. Daniele, I clearly stated that they're backing off. Do you think that's what's leading America to back off? Because let's not forget that it was a last-moment decision to call off the strike.
Okay. Definitely, then yes. Sorry, I couldn't hear you properly. Yes, definitely yes. So Iran has a lot of leverages, and these leverages are, beside the fact that Trump is running for the re-election in 2020, these options are what are perhaps refraining America to step up a military escalation. The Houthi rebels in Yemen are one side. Remember that Iran has a very powerful ally, we can almost call it a proxy, which is Hezbollah, which is in southern Lebanon, and very close to Israel, which is the staunchest American ally. Hezbollah might answer positively to a call from Iran to wage war against Israel in Syria or to create more and more tensions. Iran is also well entrenched in Syria, where the United States has a contingent and also very close and bordering to Israel. Again, the most important ally that the Americans have in West Asia. Also, Iran can make the oil trade riskier in the Strait of Hormuz. Remember that the Strait of Hormuz amounts for 75% of the oil trade of the world. So if that becomes an unsafe area, the entire global oil trade will suffer. So yes, I think that all these leverages are part of Trump's decision not to wage a full-scale military offensive against Iran.
All right, Daniele, we will continue with our discussion, but for now, the rising tensions between the United States that has taken a toll on civil aviation, that's also something we'd like to bring to your attention. The U.S. aviation regulator has issued an emergency order prohibiting all U.S. commercial flights from entering the Iranian airspace above Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It comes after the United Airlines suspended flight from Newark to Mumbai and in the aftermath of Iran shooting down an unarmed Global Hawk aircraft. Data from flight tracking websites show that more than one commercial aircraft was very close to the unpiloted Global Hawk at the time of its downing. This piece of information set alarm bells ringing over the safety of commercial jets. The U.S. has repeatedly maintained that there is a threat to its assets in Iran. Last month, too, the U.S. aviation regulator had sent an advisory to air operators. The U.S. commercial airlines were told to exercise caution in flying over Iran and its neighboring areas. Let me bring in Professor Brahmachalani on this note. Professor, you just heard the advisory that the FAA has issued. This is, of course, going to lead to tremendous economic loss for all countries involved over here. How do you think or how do you see the tensions ending if they have to end at all without a conflict?
There are two things that we have to keep in mind. That first, the Pakistani airspace is largely still closed to commercial overflights. And just the two southernmost routes in Pakistan have been reopened for east-west flights. But America's FAA has a prohibition on commercial airliners entering Pakistani airspace. So no American carrier will fly through Pakistan. And now the FAA has also issued a prohibition on flying through Iranian airspace, which makes it very difficult for American carriers to operate to India or to Southeast Asia from Europe, or to fly nonstop from American East Coast to South Asia or to Southeast Asia. So this will impinge on American carriers. The second point that we have to keep in mind is that India is already incurring major economic costs because of Trump's Iran policy. Ever since Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and then imposed sanctions on Iran, he has contributed to raising India's oil import bill. India is paying billions of dollars extra for oil imports. And now with complete embargo on Iranian oil, India's oil import bill has really shot up. Any further escalation with Iran will raise India's costs even further.
Right.
So India has to be worried that any kind of conflict between the US and Iran will impose further economic costs on India, and it will destabilize a critical region through which much of India's energy trade passes. So it's not just Iranian oil and gas, which India is no longer importing, but even Saudi and other Arab oil that India is importing would be affected by military strikes and certainly by a war between the US and Iran.
Right. Last but not the least, since you mentioned India, what are the options left for India in this entire conflict scenario?
Well, India again has very limited options. India can only express its displeasure and its concern and its anxiety and call upon both parties, Washington and Tehran, to act cautiously, not to escalate matters, but beyond the diplomatic realm of appealing for good sense to prevail. There's little that India can do, because India has often been the victim of policies of major powers that have negatively impacted on Indian security, whether it's in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or in the case of the Iraq war, Iraq invasion and occupation by the US. All these developments have impinged adversely on Indian interests.
Absolutely. Most of these developments, as you rightly mentioned, have impacted India. On a last note, let me go across to Daniele and ask him about the timing of these events and the rising tensions between the United States and Iran. Since, Daniele, let's not forget that Donald Trump has already launched his bid for 2020's presidency. Should you say that sanctioning the Iran National Guards as a terrorist organization, or the sanctions were just the beginning of their arm-twisting tactics?
I think that before what happened about this drone incident, Donald Trump meant to use Iran and his attitude over Iran as a card to play during his election campaign for the 2020, labeling the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, imposing sanctions, ever increasing sanctions, I might say, sending more troops. This was a way for him to show to the country, to the nation, to the world that America is not backing off. If they think that Iran is dangerous, they will pursue everything. But now things have escalated a bit further. either. And Trump is in the very difficult position to even weigh military option, which I don't think is something he wants. There is no president who wants to, let alone fight, start a war during his own presidential campaign, particularly a president who was elected on the promise to end America's never-ending war, not certainly to start a new one with a very powerful and militarily prepared country.
A very valid point made out there by you, Daniele. Thank you so much for bringing in your perspective. A big thank you to Professor Brahmachalani also for eking out your precious time and speaking to us here on WION. And now let's